The cellar smelled of whetstone and kerosene. Outside, snow muffled the sound of German boots crossing the cobblestones. But inside the ruined farmhouse near Bastogne, 3 Wehrmacht officers stood over a woman kneeling on the cold floor. Her Red Cross armband was torn, her uniform stained dark with blood that wasn't hers. One officer, tall, pale, with the silver insignia of a Hauptmann, held her dog tags up to the lamplight, reading the name stamped into the metal. He smiled, thin and cruel, and let the tags drop against her chest. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared straight ahead with eyes that had seen too much already. The Hauptmann leaned closer, speaking slow English, mocking. "You are nobody now, a ghost. Your own army thinks you are dead." She blinked once, slowly, and for the first time since they dragged her into that cellar, something shifted in her expression. Not fear, but something colder, something that made the youngest officer step back toward the doorway. "Before I tell you what happened next, you need to hear the whole story, and I promise you, it's not what you think. Make sure you subscribe, because stories like this, the ones that show the real cost of courage, they need to be remembered. Don't let them fade." Her name was Lieutenant Sarah Calloway. She'd been a nurse at the field hospital outside Bastogne for 3 weeks when the German counteroffensive hit. The 101st Airborne was surrounded, and the wounded kept coming in faster than the surgeons could work. She'd grown used to the sound of artillery, the way it rattled the tent poles and made the surgical lamps swing. She'd learned to sleep standing up, to eat cold rations with bloody hands, to keep moving even when exhaustion made her vision blur. The other nurses said she had steady hands. The doctors said she never flinched. On December 19th, the hospital took a direct hit. Not the main tent, the supply depot behind it. Flames lit up the snow and the German guns opened up from the tree line. Sarah was inside the surgical tent when the chaplain ran in shouting for everyone to evacuate. She didn't run. There were 4 men on the tables, one with his chest open, another missing half his leg. The surgeon looked at her, wild-eyed, and she just shook her head. They stayed. They finished. By the time they got the last man stabilized, the Germans were already in the compound. She heard boots crunching through snow, voices shouting in German, a single gunshot, then silence. The surgeon grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back flap of the tent, but it was too late. 3 Wehrmacht soldiers came through the entrance, rifles raised. One of them, an older sergeant with a scarred face, looked at the blood-soaked tables, at the wounded Americans lying motionless under blankets, and said something sharp in German. The younger soldiers lowered their weapons slightly. The sergeant pointed at Sarah. "You! Come!" They marched her across the frozen compound. She saw bodies in the snow, some in olive drab, some in gray. The main tent was burning now, collapsing inward with a roar of sparks. They took her past a burned-out jeep, past a stack of supply crates riddled with bullet holes, and into the stone farmhouse the battalion commander had been using as headquarters. Inside, it smelled like wet wool and tobacco. A German officer sat at a wooden table studying a map by candlelight. He didn't look up when they brought her in. The sergeant spoke quickly in German. The officer finally raised his head. He was younger than Sarah expected, maybe 30, with pale eyes and the collar insignia of a Hauptmann. He looked at her uniform, at the Red Cross armband barely visible under the grime and blood, and said in clear English, "You are a nurse." It wasn't a question. She nodded once. He gestured to the corner of the room where 2 German soldiers lay on stretchers, one unconscious, the other groaning softly. "Then you will help them." She moved without hesitation, knelt beside the first man. His abdomen was rigid, his breathing shallow. Internal bleeding, maybe a ruptured spleen. She looked up at the Hauptmann. "He needs surgery. Real surgery. I can't do that here." The officer's expression didn't change. "Then he will die." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned back to the wounded man. She worked with what she had, a German medic's kit, a bottle of schnapps for disinfectant, her own hands. She stopped the external bleeding, gave him morphine from a captured supply pouch, and whispered to him in the only German she knew, "Ruhig, ruhig." The second soldier had shrapnel in his shoulder. She cleaned the wound, pulled out 3 jagged pieces of metal, and wrapped it tight with gauze. He was young, maybe 19, and he kept saying "Danke" over and over until she pressed a hand to his forehead. and he finally went quiet. When she finished, her hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. The Hauptmann watched her the entire time, his face unreadable. When she stood, he gestured to a chair. Sit. She didn't. I need to get back to my patients. Your patients are dead or captured, he said flatly. You are captured. She felt the weight of that word settle over her like wet canvas. Captured. She thought of the men still lying in the surgical tent, of the surgeon who'd tried to pull her out, of the chaplain who'd probably died trying to evacuate the wounded. The Hauptmann stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered compound. Your unit thinks you are dead. We found your identification near a body. A woman. Same rank. Same unit. They will report you killed in action. Sarah's breath caught. She thought of her family back in Ohio, her mother who wrote every week, her younger brother who wanted to enlist the day he turned 18, her father who still didn't believe women should be overseas. She thought of the Red Cross office in London, of the neat line in the casualty log that would say, Lieutenant Sarah Calloway, KIA, Bastogne, Belgium. The Hauptmann turned back to her. You understand? You are a ghost now. She met his eyes. I understand. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded to the sergeant. Take her to the cellar. The older German hesitated, just for a second, then stepped forward. Sarah didn't resist. She walked down the narrow stone steps into the cold dark and heard the door bolt behind her. The cellar smelled like earth and mildew. There was a cot against one wall, a bucket in the corner, and a single high window that let in a thin line of moonlight. She sat on the cot and pressed her palms against her knees to stop them shaking. She stayed there for 2 days. They brought her water once, and a piece of black bread that tasted like sawdust. She heard boots overhead, voices arguing in German, the distant thump of American artillery trying to break the siege. On the second night, the Hauptmann came down alone. He stood in the doorway holding a lantern, the light carving shadows across his face. You are calm, he said. Most prisoners cry or beg. She looked at him without blinking. Would it change anything? He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No. He stepped into the cellar and set the lantern on the floor. I have been asking about you, he said quietly. Your name was reported. Lieutenant Sarah Calloway, Army Nurse Corps, 26 years old, from a place called Dayton. She didn't answer. He crouched down so they were at eye level. But there is something strange. Your name appears in other reports, older reports, from North Africa, from Sicily. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, but she saw him notice it. He tilted his head. Who are you? She held his gaze. I'm a nurse. He laughed softly, without humor. No, you are something else. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a transmission log, water-stained and torn at the edges. He held it up to the lantern light. This was found in a captured American command post. It lists intelligence officers embedded with medical units, and your name is here. Sarah's heart kicked hard against her ribs, but her face stayed still. The Hauptmann leaned closer. So I ask again, who are you? Before she could answer, the farmhouse above them shook, a deep rolling explosion that sent dust raining down from the ceiling. Voices shouted, boots pounded across the floor. The Hauptmann stood quickly, grabbing the lantern. He looked down at her one last time, and for a moment something flickered in his pale eyes. Not anger, but something closer to uncertainty. Then he turned and climbed the stairs, bolting the door behind him. Sarah sat in the dark, listening to the chaos above, and slowly let out the breath she'd been holding. She reached under the thin blanket on the cot and touched the small leather notebook she'd hidden in the lining of her uniform the day the Germans overran the hospital. The notebook that contained every troop movement, every supply route, every Wehrmacht position she'd documented for the past 8 months. The shelling stopped an hour before dawn. Sarah heard German voices shouting orders, engines turning over in the cold. They were moving out. She stayed on the cot, motionless, listening to the farmhouse empty. When the cellar door finally opened, it wasn't the Hauptmann. It was the scarred sergeant, the one who'd first brought her in. He came down the steps slowly, a rifle slung over his shoulder, and stood looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he said in broken English, "You come, now." They were evacuating the position. She could see it as soon as she stepped outside. Trucks loaded with wounded, soldiers forming up in columns, equipment being stripped from the farmhouse. The snow had stopped and the sky was the color of old steel. The sergeant walked her to a half-track idling near the road. 3 other prisoners sat inside, hands bound. 2 American infantrymen and a British pilot with a bandaged head. The sergeant pushed her toward them, but before she could climb in, a voice called out sharply in German. The Hauptmann stood near a staff car, a map case under his arm. He said something to the sergeant, who hesitated, then nodded and pulled Sarah back. The other prisoners watched as she was led toward the car instead. The Hauptmann opened the rear door. "You ride with me." She looked at him. "Why?" He didn't answer, just gestured for her to get in. She climbed into the back seat. The interior smelled like leather and stale cigarettes. A moment later, he slid in beside her, and the driver put the car in gear. They drove east, away from Bastogne. The roads were chewed up by armor, lined with abandoned equipment and frozen corpses half buried in snow. Sarah kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the Hauptmann watching her. After 20 minutes, he spoke. "You are wondering why you are not with the other prisoners." She said nothing. He leaned back against the seat. "I am wondering the same thing." He pulled the folded transmission log from his coat again, studied it. "This document, it troubles me." She finally looked at him. "Why?" He met her gaze. "Because if you are what I think you are, I should execute you immediately. Intelligence officers caught behind lines have no protections. No Geneva Convention." He let that hang in the cold air between them. "But if I am wrong, I have killed a nurse, a woman who saved the lives of my men." Sarah's voice came out steady. "So which am I?" He smiled thinly. "That is what I intend to discover." They stopped at a commandeered schoolhouse in a village whose name Sarah didn't catch. The Hauptmann took her inside, past German soldiers cooking over fires in oil drums, past a makeshift aid station where medics worked on wounded. He led her upstairs to a classroom that had been turned into an office. Maps covered the walls. A field telephone sat on the teacher's desk. He closed the door and gestured to a chair. "Sit." This time she did. He paced in front of the windows, hands behind his back. "You were in North Africa, Tobruk, El Alamein." "Yes." She said nothing. He continued. "Then Sicily, Palermo. You moved with the field hospitals, always near the front, always near command posts." He stopped pacing and turned to face her. "And everywhere you went, intelligence reports followed. Accurate reports, detailed reports." He leaned against the desk. "Too accurate for random luck." Sarah kept her expression flat. "You're making assumptions." He shook his head. "I am connecting facts." He opened a folder on the desk, pulled out a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed a woman in a nurse's uniform standing outside a tent, talking to an American officer. The woman's face was partially turned away, but the resemblance was clear. "This was taken in Sicily, August 1943. That is you." She looked at the photograph, then back at him. "Nurses talk to officers all the time." "Not this officer," the Hauptmann said quietly. "This officer was Colonel James Hartley, OSS, Office of Strategic Services." He let that sink in. He died 3 weeks after this photograph was taken, killed in an air raid. But before he died, he sent dozens of reports to London, and those reports cost us thousands of men. The room felt smaller suddenly. Sarah's pulse was loud in her ears, but she kept her breathing even. The Hauptmann crossed his arms. "So I ask you one more time, who are you?" She stared at him for a long moment, then she said, "I'm a nurse who does her job." His jaw tightened. "You are lying." She leaned forward slightly. "Prove it." Something flickered across his face. Frustration, maybe respect. He grabbed the folder, shoved it back into his case. "You think you are clever, but I will find the truth." He walked to the door, then stopped. "And when I do, Lieutenant Calloway, you will wish I had shot you in that cellar." He locked her in the classroom. She heard his boots descending the stairs, heard him barking orders in the hallway below. She stood and moved to the window. The village was small, maybe a dozen buildings, most of them damaged. A church steeple leaned at an angle, half collapsed. German troops moved through the streets, setting up defensive positions. She turned back to the room and studied the maps on the walls. Troop deployments, supply lines, defensive sectors. She memorized everything she could before she heard footsteps on the stairs again. It was a different officer this time, older, with the rank insignia of a major. He came in without knocking, closed the door behind him. He had a thin face and cold eyes, and he studied her the way someone might study an insect pinned to a board. "The Hauptmann believes you may be valuable," he said in clipped, precise English. "I believe you are a waste of resources." He walked closer. "I think we should resolve this quickly." He pulled a pistol from his holster and set it on the desk between them. A Luger, the metal dull in the gray light from the window. "I have read the reports," he said. "I have seen the photograph. I believe you are a spy." Sarah didn't move, didn't look at the gun. The major continued. "But the Hauptmann wants proof, so I will give him proof." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather notebook. Her notebook. Sarah's chest went tight. He must have searched her while she was being moved. He opened it, flipped through the pages. "Very detailed," he said softly. "Very thorough." He looked up at her. "This is enough to have you shot 10 times over." Sarah's mind raced. She'd been so careful. The notebook was coded, deliberately vague, but in the hands of someone trained to read intelligence reports, the patterns would be obvious. The major closed the notebook and held it up. "The Hauptmann does not know I have this yet. He is downstairs arguing with the battalion commander about whether to hold this village or fall back." He stepped closer. "I could take this to him now, or—" He paused. "You could tell me what I want to know, and I will destroy it. No one needs to see this." Sarah finally spoke. "What do you want to know?" He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Everything. How you gathered intelligence. Who you reported to. What networks are still operating behind our lines." She met his eyes. "And if I tell you?" He shrugged. "You live as a prisoner, not as a corpse." She let the silence stretch. Then she said, "I need a guarantee." The major laughed. A short, sharp sound. "You are in no position to negotiate." Sarah leaned back in her chair, forcing herself to appear calm. "Then shoot me, because without a guarantee I'll die either way." His smile faded. He picked up the Luger, checked the chamber. "You think I will not do it?" She looked at the gun, then back at him. "I think you want information more than you want a body." Before he could respond, the door flew open. The Hauptmann stood in the doorway, his face flushed. He looked at the major, at the gun on the desk, at the notebook in the major's hand. "What is this?" The major turned, unbothered. "I am doing what you should have done." The Hauptmann's voice went cold. "That prisoner is under my authority." The major held up the notebook. "This prisoner is a spy, and this is the proof." The Hauptmann crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched the notebook from the major's hand. He opened it, scanned the pages, and his expression changed. Something between shock and fury. He looked at Sarah. "Where did you get this?" She said nothing. The major spoke instead. "She has been carrying it. It contains intelligence on our positions, movements, supply routes." The Hauptmann's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the notebook. He looked at Sarah for a long time, and she saw the moment he understood. "You were not just a nurse," he said quietly. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady. "No, I wasn't." The Hauptmann closed the notebook slowly. The major reached for his pistol. "Then we are done here." But the Hauptmann held up a hand. "Wait." The major frowned. "Wait for what?" "You have your proof." The Hauptmann didn't take his eyes off Sarah. "I want to know why." Sarah exhaled slowly. "Why what?" He stepped closer. "Why you risked everything? You could have stayed in a field hospital behind the lines, safe, comfortable, but you came to the front, again and again. Why?" She held his gaze. "Because someone had to." The Hauptmann stared at her, and for a moment something like understanding passed between them. Then the door burst open again, and a young German soldier stumbled in, wild-eyed. "Sir, American patrol, 2 kilometers west, they are coming fast." The Hauptmann spun toward the window. In the distance, Sarah could hear it now. Engines, the growl of American armor. The village erupted into motion below. The Hauptmann turned back to Sarah, the notebook still in his hand, his face torn between duty and something else she couldn't name. The major grabbed his pistol from the desk. "We execute her now and fall back." The Hauptmann didn't move. He stared at Sarah, at the notebook, at the maps on the wall behind her. No. The major's face went red. She is a spy. She has... The Hauptmann cut him off. I know what she is. He turned to face the major fully. And I also know she saved the lives of 3 of my men. She had chances to run, to hide, to let them die. She did not. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. Rifle fire cracked in the distance. The young soldier in the doorway shouted, "Sir, we must evacuate now." The Hauptmann looked at Sarah one more time, then made his decision. He shoved the notebook into his coat and grabbed her arm. "Come." The major blocked the door. "You cannot take her. She will be liberated. She will tell them everything." The Hauptmann's voice went cold. "Move, or I will move you." For a moment, the 2 officers stood frozen, the tension thick enough to cut. Then the major stepped aside, his jaw clenched with rage. The Hauptmann pulled Sarah out of the room, down the stairs, into the chaos of the village street. German soldiers were running toward trucks, grabbing weapons, shouting orders. An explosion rocked the far end of the street, American artillery finding range. The Hauptmann dragged her toward his staff car, pushed her into the back seat, and climbed in beside her. "Drive!" he shouted to his driver. They roared out of the village, heading northeast. Behind them, Sarah could hear the battle intensifying. Machine gun fire, the deep boom of tank cannons, the sharp crack of grenades. She looked back through the rear window and saw American Sherman tanks rolling into the village square, infantry fanning out behind them. The Hauptmann sat rigid beside her, the notebook clutched in one hand. After 10 minutes of silence, he finally spoke. "I should have let him shoot you." Sarah turned to look at him. "Why didn't you?" He didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window at the frozen countryside rushing past. Finally he said, "Because I do not know if you are my enemy or simply a soldier doing her duty." She let out a slow breath. "Does it matter?" He looked at her then, and she saw exhaustion in his pale eyes. "Yes, it matters." He pulled the notebook out and opened it again, flipping through the pages more carefully now. He stopped on one page, studied it. "This code. It is simple but effective." He looked at her. "You wrote this after we captured you." It wasn't a question. She nodded slowly. "Yes." He showed her the page, a list of numbers and abbreviations she'd scratched in while locked in the cellar, documenting the German positions she'd heard discussed above her. "You were still gathering intelligence, even as a prisoner." She met his eyes. "I told you. I'm a soldier doing my duty." The Hauptmann closed the notebook and leaned back against the seat. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "In 1940, I was in France. We captured a British officer near Dunkirk. He had maps, documents, everything we needed to track their retreat." He paused. "My commander wanted to execute him as a spy, but I argued that he was a soldier, a uniformed combatant. In the end, we sent him to a POW camp." He looked at Sarah. "He escaped 6 months later, rejoined his unit, killed 38 of my countrymen in North Africa." Sarah held his gaze. "Do you regret sparing him?" The Hauptmann's jaw tightened. "Every day." The car hit a rut in the road and bounced hard. The driver cursed in German. They were climbing now, into hills thick with pine trees. The Hauptmann leaned forward and spoke to the driver, who nodded and turned onto a smaller road heading west. Sarah frowned. "Where are we going?" The Hauptmann didn't look at her. "Away from the front." They drove for another hour. The landscape grew more remote. Narrow roads, deep forest, no signs of war except the occasional abandoned vehicle or collapsed bridge. Finally, they stopped at a crossroads in the middle of nowhere. The Hauptmann got out and walked a few paces away from the car, standing in the cold with his back to her. His driver lit a cigarette and watched him nervously. Sarah sat in the back seat, her hands numb from cold, her mind racing through possibilities. When the Hauptmann came back, his face was set like stone. He opened the rear door. "Get out." Sarah climbed out slowly. The wind cut through her thin uniform. He reached into the car and pulled out a German greatcoat, handed it to her. "Put this on." She stared at him. "Why?" He didn't answer. He walked her away from the car, down the road about 20 meters, until they were out of earshot of his driver. Then he stopped and turned to face her. "I am going to tell you something," he said quietly, "and you will listen carefully." She nodded. He pulled the notebook from his coat and held it up between them. "This notebook contains information that could get you executed by my army." Buy yours, buy anyone who finds it. He paused. But it also contains information that could save lives. On both sides. He stared at her. You understand this, yes? She said carefully. Yes. He looked back toward his car, then at the trees surrounding them. There is a village, 8 kilometers west. Small, mostly civilians. The Americans will reach it by tomorrow. He met her eyes again. You will walk there. You will find them. You will tell them you escaped. Sarah's breath caught. You're letting me go? His expression didn't change. I am making a choice I will likely regret. He held out the notebook. Take it. She reached for it slowly, half expecting him to pull it back. But he let it go. She held it in both hands, the leather cold and worn. Why? She whispered. The Hauptmann stepped closer. Because you are right. You are a soldier, and soldiers on both sides are dying because men like me and men like your commanders cannot see past the war to the human beings fighting it. He gestured toward the west. You saved my men. I am saving you. We are even. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. They'll shoot you if they find out. He almost smiled. Yes, they will. He turned and started walking back toward the car, then stopped and looked over his shoulder. Lieutenant Calloway, the war will end, someday. When it does, remember that not all Germans were monsters, and not all choices were simple. She nodded slowly. I will. He climbed back into the staff car. The engine turned over. The driver looked at her through the window, confused, but the Hauptmann said something sharp and they pulled away. Sarah stood alone on the frozen road, the notebook in her hands, the German greatcoat heavy on her shoulders. She watched the staff car disappear around a bend, then turned west and started walking. The snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Her boots crunched through the frozen crust. She thought about the Hauptmann's face when he handed her the notebook. She thought about the cellar in Bastogne, the men on the stretchers, the major's pistol on the desk. She thought about duty and mercy and the thin line between them. She walked for 3 hours before she saw the village, a cluster of stone houses with smoke rising from chimneys. As she got closer, she heard American voices, saw olive-drab uniforms. A patrol spotted her and raised their rifles, then lowered them when they saw the Red Cross armband under the German coat. A sergeant ran toward her, eyes wide. Ma'am? Ma'am? Are you okay? She nodded, suddenly exhausted. I'm Lieutenant Calloway, Army Nurse Corps. I was captured at Bastogne. I escaped. They brought her to their command post in a farmhouse with radios and maps and officers smoking cigarettes. A captain interviewed her, took notes, kept asking if she was injured, if she needed medical attention. She answered mechanically, giving them just enough detail to be believable. When he asked how she escaped, she said she'd been left unguarded during an evacuation and slipped away in the confusion. He seemed to believe her. They gave her coffee, real coffee, and it tasted like heaven. That night, they radioed headquarters. The next morning, a jeep came to take her back to a field hospital behind the lines. As they drove through the snow-covered roads, past columns of American troops moving up to the front, she touched the notebook hidden again in the lining of her uniform. She thought about the Hauptmann, about the choice he'd made, about the 38 men the British officer had killed after being spared. She wondered what her intelligence would cost, how many lives it would save, how many it would take. 6 weeks later, the intelligence from her notebook helped Allied forces identify a major German supply route. The route was destroyed in a coordinated airstrike. Over 400 German soldiers died. Sarah heard about it in a briefing and felt something twist in her chest. She thought about the Hauptmann, whether he was still alive, whether he knew what his mercy had cost. She never saw him again. The war ended 4 months later. She went home to Dayton, to her family, to a life that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. But she never forgot the crossroads, the notebook in her hands, the German greatcoat heavy on her shoulders, and the officer who chose mercy over duty, knowing it might destroy him. Years later, when people asked about the war, she would tell them about the field hospitals, the surgeries, the soldiers she'd saved. But she never told them about the cellar in Bastogne, or the man who let her walk away. Some stories don't have easy answers. Some choices live with you forever, in the quiet hours, in the space between what was right and what was necessary. If this story meant something to you, If you understand that war is never simple and courage comes in forms we don't expect, then subscribe. Help us keep telling these stories. The ones that show the truth, that even in the darkest times humanity survives in the smallest acts of mercy. Don't let these memories fade. They matter now more than ever.